The history we read in textbooks is not always true. It is called history written by the victors. But behind America's bright democratic image, there are some files buried that are beyond the imagination of the common man. Today, we will reveal those 10 dark truths of American history, which were once top secret. While America's history is diverse and filled with stories of progress, it also has some very dark and controversial chapters. Here are 10 such dark truths from American history. Genocide of Native Americans, a historical and systematic analysis. Pre-Columbian era, European arrival and biological warfare, 1492 to 1650. Introduction, Myth versus Reality. The history of the Americas conjures up stories of heroism, the establishment of democracy, and the rise of modern civilization. But behind this bright image lies one of the largest and longest genocides in world history. When European explorers set foot on the continent, there was no empty land. There was a developed civilization thousands of years old, with its own language, laws, and religion. This systematic destruction of Native Americans was not only accomplished through warfare, it was accomplished through disease, starvation, forced displacement, and cultural destruction. Pre-Columbian America, a prosperous settlement. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas in 1492, historians disagree about the population of indigenous peoples in North and South America. But modern research suggests that it was between 50 and 100 million. At that time, hundreds of independent ethnic groups lived in North America, such as the Cherokee, Iroquois, Navajo, Sioux, and Apache. Their agricultural system was highly developed. They were self-sufficient in food by cultivating the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Their political structure was so strong that much of the modern federal structure of America is believed to be inspired by the Constitution of the Iroquois Confederacy. The process of destroying this prosperous civilization began from the moment Columbus set foot. The first conflict and the destruction of Hispaniola. When Christopher Columbus first saw the natives, whom he mistakenly called Indians, he wrote in his diary, "They are very kind and have no weapons. With only 50 soldiers, it is possible to enslave them all." This mentality was the main basis of the genocide. On the island of Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Spaniards subjected the natives to unspeakable torture in search of gold. Those who could not pay a certain amount of gold had their hands cut off. The historian Bartolomeo de las Casas, himself a priest, wrote as an eyewitness how the Spaniards would beat children and set dogs on the natives. In just a few decades, the indigenous population of the island was almost empty. The great catastrophe of epidemics, the invisible killer. The most terrible chapter in the genocide against the natives of America was disease. When Europeans arrived on the continent, they unknowingly and later consciously brought with them diseases against which the natives had no immunity. Smallpox, this was the bane of the natives. Once the disease entered a village, the entire village would be devastated. In 1520, smallpox in Mexico brought down the Aztec Empire like a house of cards. Other diseases, measles, influenza, typhus, and malaria killed millions. The beginning of biological warfare. Although diseases initially spread naturally, later they were used as weapons of mass destruction. During the siege of Fort Pitt in 1763, British General Geoffrey Amherst instructed his subordinates, "Can we not spread smallpox among the natives? We must use every means to destroy them." They distributed blankets used by smallpox patients as gifts to the natives, one of the first planned biological attacks in history. 5. Impact of British and French colonization in North America. The English settlement of Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth Rock in 1620 marked the beginning of a new crisis in North America. Although the natives initially helped the whites, as in the story of the first Thanksgiving, the relation quickly turned sour. To the Europeans, land was a commodity or private property which could be bought and sold. To the natives, land was mother or sacred nature, open to all. In this ideological conflict, the whites began to seize land at gunpoint. The Pequot War of 1637 was a turning point. In Connecticut, English soldiers set fire to a Pequot village and burned alive between 500 and 600 women, children, and men. Those who tried to escape were killed with the sword. After this incident, it was declared that no more people called Pequot would exist. 6. Demographic collapse. By 1650, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean islands and much of Central and South America had disappeared. Historians estimate that within 150 years of Columbus's arrival, about 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had disappeared. This massive loss of life was not simply the result of war, but a terrible mix of planned starvation, slavery, and disease. White settlers burned the indigenous people's crops and stopped hunting their wild animals, such as bison or bullseye, so they starved to death. The politics of the expansion of the Republic and the displacement, 1776 to 1830. 1. The American Revolution and the crisis of the Native Americans. The American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, in 1776 was not limited to the British and the Americans. It faced a difficult crisis for the Native Americans. Most Native American groups, such as the Iroquois Confederacy, supported the British because the British had banned white settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains through the Proclamation of 1763. But after America gained independence, the Native Americans lost their greatest protection. The Native Americans became the conquered enemy to the new American government. George Washington, who is called the Father of America, was very strict about the seizure of Native American lands. In 1779, he ordered General John Sullivan to destroy the villages of the native Iroquois in such a way that they could not return. Sullivan burned more than 40 villages and their entire grain stores to the ground. The natives began to call Washington the Town Destroyer. 2. Manifest Destiny, the claim to God-given rights. In the early 19th century, a very powerful and dangerous ideology emerged in America called manifest destiny. It was the belief that white Americans had a God-given right to dominate the entire North American continent. Proponents of this ideology believed that the natives were savages and did not know how to properly use the land. Therefore, it was legitimate to take their land for the sake of civilization and the spread of Christianity. This racist philosophy gave a moral form to genocide and extermination. White settlers believed that their journey westward was not only a political, but also a sacred religious duty. 3. Civilization versus expulsion, the 5 civilized tribes. In the 1800s, the southeastern United States, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, was inhabited by 5 major indigenous tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. White Americans called them the 5 civilized tribes. Why were they called civilized? Because they had largely adopted white culture. The Cherokee developed their own written alphabet, published newspapers, wrote a constitution, and even adopted white-style agriculture and dress. Their goal was peaceful coexistence with whites. But their civilization did not save them.
Because the land they lived on was very fertile for cotton cultivation and had gold mines, the land became more valuable to the Americans than the lives of the indigenous people. 4. Andrew Jackson, the main enemy of the Indians. The 7th President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, was the main architect of the removal of the Indians. As a military general before becoming president, he led numerous brutal wars against the Indians. In 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, he killed several hundred Indians and ordered the bodies to be counted by cutting off their noses so that the exact number of dead could be known. Upon coming to power in 1829, Jackson set his main goal to completely remove the Indians. He believed that the Indians could never be part of American society, and their removal was essential for the security of the state. 5. Indian Removal Act of 1830. May 28, 1830 is a black day in American history. On this day, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The main content of this law was that all the native people living east of the Mississippi River would be forcibly removed to the west of the river, present-day Oklahoma. This law was widely debated in American Congress. Some humane leaders opposed it, but pressure from the southern states and Jackson's insistence led to the passage of the law. This was no ordinary relocation. It was a state plan to uproot a nation that was thousands of years old. This law stripped the natives of their sovereignty and treated them as trespassers on their own land. 6. Contempt of the Supreme Court. John Marshall versus Jackson. The Cherokee Nation decided to fight this injustice legally. In 1832, the Supreme Court of the United States made a historic ruling in the case of Worcester versus Georgia. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Cherokee were an independent nation and that neither the state of Georgia nor the federal government could take away their land. This was a huge victory for the Native Americans. But in an unprecedented move in the history of democracy, President Andrew Jackson refused to accept the Supreme Court's ruling. He boasted, "John Marshall has given his verdict, now let's see how he carries it out." When the head of state of a democratic country ignores the ruling of his country's highest court and deploys the military, it is clear that the fate of the Native Americans has been sealed. 7. Preparations for removal, tactics and betrayal. The government realized that the Native Americans would not easily give up their land, so they resorted to corruption. They found some greedy or fearful individuals among the Native Americans and got them to sign fake treaties. In the case of the Cherokee, the Treaty of New Echota was one such fraudulent document. Although the main leadership of the Cherokee Nation and the common people strongly opposed this treaty, the U.S. government claimed that the Cherokee had voluntarily agreed to give up their land. This legal phenomenon and political intrigue set the stage for one of the most brutal military campaigns in history, which over the next few years was stained with the blood of thousands of innocent people.
Trail of Tears. Death and Human Disaster, 1831 to 1839. 1. The beginning of removal, the first sacrifice of the Choctaw Nation. The first people to be removed from their lands after the law was passed in 1830 were the Choctaws. In a bitter winter in 1831, they were forced to march from Mississippi to Oklahoma. The U.S. government did not provide them with adequate food, wagons, or blankets. As the Choctaws marched through the snow, thousands of them died of pneumonia and cholera. A Choctaw leader gave a newspaper interview at the time, describing the journey as a trail of tears and death. This is where the term Trail of Tears came from.
Historians estimate that between 2,500 and 6,000 of the 15,000 Choctaws who were evicted died en route. 2. Internment and military campaign against the Cherokee Nation. While other tribes had yielded to pressure, the Cherokee continued their legal struggle until the very end. But in 1838, President Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's successor, sent General Winfield Scott with 7,000 troops to forcibly remove the Cherokees. General Scott's troops carried out this campaign with great brutality. They entered Cherokee homes without any prior warning. Many families were eating lunch or working in the fields. They were forced out of their homes at gunpoint. The soldiers set fire to the homes and looted the natives' livestock and crops. The whites even dug up the graves of the dead natives and stole their jewelry. 3. The horrors of the stockades. Before the main march began, approximately 17,000 Cherokee were held in various temporary detention camps, or stockades. These camps were similar to modern-day concentration camps. Inhumane conditions. Thousands of people were crammed into small spaces under the open sky. There were no adequate toilets or clean water. Spread of disease. Due to the filthy conditions, cholera, dysentery, and whooping cough spread in epidemics. Hundreds of children and the elderly died in these detention camps alone. Torture. Many eyewitnesses described how U.S. soldiers physically and sexually abused Native women. This confinement was a planned tactic to break the morale of the Native people. 4. The 1,200-mile Death March. In late 1838, the Cherokees began to be divided into 3 groups and marched to Oklahoma. The journey was about 1,200 miles long. Most of the Cherokees had to walk this route because only the sick and the elderly could fit in the wagons. The cruelty of nature. Unfortunately, that winter was one of the most severe in American history. The Mississippi River froze over. The Native Americans did not have adequate winter clothing or shoes. Many had to walk barefoot on the ice. Starvation. The food promised by the government was of very poor quality and in small quantities. Due to corruption, contractors supplied rotten meat and corn. The Native Americans tried to survive by eating forest plants and roots. 5. Death toll and eyewitness accounts. Although the number of deaths on the Cherokee journey is disputed, the most widely accepted estimate is that about 4,000 of the 17,000 Cherokee died along the way. That is, 1 in 4 Cherokee died. An American soldier who participated in the evacuation later wrote in his diary, "I have seen the Civil War and seen thousands shot to death, but I have never seen such cruelty as this evacuation. Mothers sit on the snow crying with their dead children in their arms, and we force them forward with guns." The Indians were not even allowed time to bury them. In many cases, the bodies were dug in shallow pits by the roadside or buried under the snow. The pain of leaving loved ones behind was indescribable. 6. Seminole Resistance, the Bloody War in Florida. Not all of them left the land without a fight. The Seminole people of Florida waged a guerrilla war against the U.S. Army for 7 years, 1835 to 1842. Their leader, Osceola, had been a white man's scapegoat. The American government resorted to treachery to win the war. Osceola was summoned and imprisoned under the pretext of negotiations. Although most of the Seminoles were eventually sent to Oklahoma, A small number remained hidden in the Everglades swamps of Florida. This war was very costly and bloody for America. 7. The fate of the Creek and Chickasaw people. The Creeks and Chickasaws also suffered the same fate. The Creeks were chained and marched. About 3,500 of the 15,000 Creeks died of starvation and disease. Although the Chickasaws were promised some financial compensation, they found that there was no means of subsistence in their new homeland. The U.S. government sent them to an area, Oklahoma, where the climate and soil were completely different from their ancestral homeland. This was not just a geographical transfer, it was the complete destruction of a people's identity and way of life.
The Western Bloody Horizon and the Buffalo Slaughter, 1840 to 1890. Westward expansion and new conflict. After the 1840s, America's attention turned to the vast plains of the West. In the excitement of the California Gold Rush and the construction of railroads, whites began to enter the territories of the Native Americans in droves. The Native Americans, who had once been allowed to live permanently on the other side of the Mississippi River, were now planned to be removed from there as well. In particular, warlike tribes such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, Apache, and Comanche became direct targets of the U.S. military. Buffalo slaughter, the strategy of killing with rice. The lives and economy of the Plains Indians, or the Native Americans of the Plains, depended entirely on the American bison, or buffalo. Buffalo was their main source of food, and their skins were used to make houses, or teepees, and clothing. The U.S. government realized that it was easier to destroy the food source than to defeat the Indians with guns. In the 1870s, the U.S. Army and white hunters began a systematic killing of millions of buffalo. General Philip Sheridan said, "The Indians cannot be domesticated until the buffalo are gone." Statistics. In 1800, the number of buffalo was about 30 to 60 million. By 1880, it had decreased to only a few hundred. Consequences. The Indians faced a severe famine. Thousands of Indians who were dying of starvation were forced to accept the terms of the U.S. government and take refuge in reservations like concentration camps. This was one of the largest environmental and economic genocides in history. Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. In the chaos of the Civil War, an unimaginable atrocity occurred at Sand Creek, Colorado. A peaceful band of Cheyenne and Arapaho people were camped there under the protection of the U.S. government. Their leader, Black Kettle, had flown the American flag and a white flag over his tent as a sign of friendship. But a band of 700 soldiers led by Colonel John Chivington attacked the sleeping Indians at dawn. They killed about 200 Indians, 2/3 of whom were women and children. The soldiers horribly mutilated the bodies and mutilated the women to display them as victory trophies. This incident proved that the lives of the Indians were of no value to the Americans. They were considered only enemies. Little Bighorn and the Sioux resistance. Not all the natives surrendered without a fight. In 1876, the Sioux, led by the legendary warriors Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, defeated and killed the American general Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. This was a great victory for the natives, but this victory turned out to be a dark day for them. Desperate for revenge, the U.S. government attacked the Sioux with full military force. In one battle after another, the natives' resources were destroyed and they were driven from the mountains and forests. Ghost dance and spiritual revival. In the late 1880s, a new spiritual movement began among the natives known as the ghost dance. They believed that through this dance, the whites would leave, the dead natives would return, and the buffalo herd would return to nature.
The Americans were frightened by this peaceful dance of the natives. They thought that the natives might rebel again. One of the greatest tragedies in history was born from this unfounded fear. Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. This heinous massacre occurred on December 29, 1890, while disarming a group of Sioux natives along the Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. General Custer's old regiment, the 7th Cavalry, surrounded these natives. When a sudden shot was fired during the search, the American soldiers started firing on the unarmed people from all sides with machine guns, Hotchkiss guns. Death toll. About 300 natives were killed in just a few minutes, most of whom were women and children. Those who fled for fear of their lives in the blizzard were also chased 2 to 3 miles and killed. Mass graves. The bodies, frozen after a few days due to snowfall, were buried in a huge pit. Even today, those pictures are the ultimate evidence of the torture of the indigenous people. Awards. After this heinous massacre, 20 American soldiers were given the Medal of Honor, which is still a matter of great controversy and humiliation. Reservation system, open prison. At the end of the 19th century, the surviving indigenous people were pushed into specific territories called reservations. These lands were barren and uncultivable. They were forbidden to hunt or move freely there. They became completely dependent on government rations. This captivity broke the indigenous people mentally and changed their traditional way of life forever. Disease, poverty, and despair became constant companions on these reservations. Cultural eradication and modern warfare, 1890s to present. 1. Kill the Indian, save the man. Cultural genocide. After the last flame of armed resistance at Wounded Knee in 1890 was extinguished, the American government adopted a new strategy. They realized that while it was possible to destroy the bodies of the Indians, it was difficult to destroy their souls and culture. Thus began cultural genocide. Captain Richard Henry Pratt was the main proponent of this philosophy. His famous quote was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." In other words, the goal of this campaign was to separate the Indians from their language, religion, and traditions and assimilate them into white Christian society. 2. Indian boarding schools. Inhumanity to children. A dark chapter began with the establishment of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879. The government forcibly took thousands of Native American children from their parents and sent them to these residential schools. Identity theft. As soon as children arrived at school, their long hair was cut off. Long hair was a symbol of honor for Native Americans. Their traditional clothing was burned, and they were dressed in European clothing. They even changed their Native American names to English ones. Language and religion. Speaking Native American languages was strictly forbidden. Anyone who spoke their native language was punished by being whipped or having soap poured into their mouths. They were forcibly converted to Christianity. Torture and death. Physical and sexual abuse was a common occurrence in these schools. Thousands of children died of tuberculosis and other diseases due to the unsanitary conditions and mental anguish. In recent years, hundreds of unmarked mass graves of children have been found under these schools in America and Canada, which has shocked the world. 4. Dawes Act in 1887 and land theft. In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed to take away the remaining land of the indigenous people. The indigenous people lived communally. They did not believe in private ownership. But through this law, the land of the indigenous people was divided into small private plots. The intention was to make the indigenous people farmers, but as a result, they lost about 90 million acres of land. The remaining lands were declared surplus and sold to the whites. As a result, the indigenous people lost their social and economic structure and suffered extreme poverty. Forced sterilization. Even in the middle of the 20th century, inhuman experiments on the indigenous people did not stop. In the 1970s, the Indian Health Service, IHS, sterilized thousands of Native American women without their consent or under false pretenses. Studies have shown that 25% to 50% of women in some tribes were sterilized. This was a terrible conspiracy to stop the population growth rate of an ethnic group. 5. Modern-day crisis. Poverty and health risks. Native Americans still bear the brunt of centuries of injustice inflicted on them. According to current American statistics, the poverty rate among Native Americans is much higher than the average American poverty rate. Unemployment and housing shortages are extreme in reservation areas. Health. The average life expectancy among Native Americans is 5.5 years lower than other Americans. Rates of diabetes, heart disease, and drug addiction are alarmingly high among this population. Missing and dead women, MMWI. A major crisis in America today is the disappearance and murder of Native women. Thousands of indigenous women are missing, but the U.S. justice system and police have always been indifferent to this issue. 6. Resistance and resilience. Despite all the persecution and attempted genocide, indigenous people have not been completely wiped out. In recent years, they've become vigilant in demanding their rights. Standing Rock Movement, 2016. Indigenous people in Oklahoma organized a massive movement to protect their sacred land and water sources, which attracted the attention of the world. Cultural practices. Many indigenous groups are currently trying to bring back their lost languages and traditions. They are presenting the history of their ancestors to new generations. We will discuss environmental genocide, the modern legal battle, and the rationale for calling it genocide in the international arena. Genocide of Indigenous Peoples, a historical and systematic analysis. Part 6. Environmental racism, modern legal conflict, and the recognition of genocide. 1. Environmental genocide, the Navajo and uranium. A new kind of silent attack on indigenous peoples began in the mid-20th century. In particular, uranium was found in large quantities in the Navajo Nation of the American Southwest. During the Cold War, the U.S. government and large companies forced indigenous peoples to work in mines without any health protection. Victims of radiation. Radioactivity from mines poisoned indigenous water and soil. Thousands of Navajo people suffered from cancer and lung disease. Abandoned mines. There are still hundreds of abandoned uranium mines in Navajo territory that have not been cleaned up. Many sociologists have called this a slow genocide. 2. Indian Relocation Act of 1956. After boarding schools, this was another major move to destroy Native American culture. In the 1950s, the U.S. government lured Native Americans off reservations, promising them good jobs and homes. The main goal? To separate Native Americans from their tribal communities and permanently erase tribal claims to their lands. The result? Thousands of Native Americans ended up in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Denver, where they faced extreme discrimination and poverty. They were unable to integrate into white society or return to their roots. This resulted in the urban Indian crisis, where a generation lost their language. 3. Alaska and Hawaii, the forgotten displacement. When we talk about the genocide of indigenous peoples, we often think of the mainland, but similar atrocities were committed against the Native Americans of Alaska and the Hawaiian Islands. In Hawaii, in 1893, American businessmen, with the help of the military, overthrew the Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, and forcibly took over the island. The language and culture of the native Hawaiians were suppressed there. Alaska. There, indigenous people were evicted from their lands, and huge pipelines were built to extract oil and mineral resources, which destroyed their natural way of life forever. 4. Why is this genocide or genocide under international law? Many American historians hesitate to call it a genocide, but according to the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, what happened to Native Americans was clearly genocide. All 5 criteria of the UN definition are present. 1. Killing members, as in battlefields and in massacres such as Wounded Knee. 2. Causing serious physical or mental harm, as in reservations and in concentration camps. 3. Destruction of living conditions, as in the killing of buffalo to try to kill Native Americans. 4. Birth control, as in the forced sterilization program of the 1970s. 5. Forced transfer of children to another group, as in the boarding school system. 5. The land back movement, the struggle of the present. In the 21st century, Native Americans are no longer just victims, they are now fighters. Currently, a movement called Land Back has intensified across North America. It demands that lands that were illegally taken away in violation of treaties be returned to indigenous peoples. In 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court made a historic ruling in the case of McGirt versus Oklahoma. The court recognized that half of the state of Oklahoma is legally included in the reservation area of indigenous peoples. This is a major victory for indigenous peoples in a century-long legal battle. 6. Truth and reconciliation. Currently, there is a demand that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be established in America, like in Canada, where the injustices committed against indigenous peoples will be fully investigated and government compensation will be provided. After Deb Haaland was appointed as America's first Indigenous Secretary of the Interior in 2021, an investigation into deaths in boarding schools has begun, which is an initial step towards fulfilling the responsibility of history. Religious pretexts, last stand, and modern blood politics. 1. Doctrine of discovery, the religious basis for theft. The seizure of Native American lands was not simply a matter of gunpowder, but a controversial religious and legal theory. In the 15th century, a papal bull declared that if a Christian king found non-Christian or pagan land, he would become the owner. Legal implications? The U.S. Supreme Court adopted this theory in the 1823 case of Johnson versus McIntosh. The court held that Native Americans lost ownership of their lands when Europeans arrived in America and could only live there as occupants. The result? This racist law still serves as the basis for American land law, which deprives Native Americans of full rights to their ancestral lands. 2. The Last Heroes Fight, Geronimo and Chief Joseph. When the indigenous peoples were on the verge of extinction in the latter half of the 19th century, some great leaders fought to the last drop of their blood. Geronimo, this legendary Apache warrior, waged guerrilla warfare on the American-Mexican border for decades. 5,000 American soldiers were assigned to capture him, but he had only 35 warriors with him. His surrender in 1886 officially ended the American Indian Wars. Chief Joseph. This Nez Perce leader tried to escape to Canada with his people by traveling 1,100 miles to avoid being imprisoned on a reservation. He was captured just 40 miles from the border. His famous quote, "I will fight no more forever," conveys the Indians' bitter grief and defeat. 3. Historical trauma, wounds that are carried through generations. Genocide doesn't just end with the death of people, it leaves scars in the DNA of descendants. Psychologists call this historical trauma. Impact? Children who were abused in boarding schools have higher rates of suicide, depression, and domestic violence among their descendants. Researchers have found that the current health crisis among indigenous peoples is rooted in the memories of the horrific atrocities committed against their ancestors that remain in their subconscious minds. 4. Blood quantum, statistical genocide. In modern America, there is a strange rule called blood quantum to determine the identity of indigenous people. It determines exactly how much indigenous blood a person has in their body. Strategy? If an indigenous person marries someone from another ethnic group, the indigenous blood percentage of their children decreases. The U.S. government has made it a rule that if this percentage drops below a certain level, that person will no longer be recognized as native. This is a subtle move. According to historians, through this, the government wants to gradually reduce the number of Native Americans to 0 on paper, so that they will not have to be given any land or facilities. This is called statistical genocide. 5. MMIW crisis, a silent genocide of the present. One of the biggest dark truths of current America is missing and murdered indigenous women, MMIW. Native women are murdered 10 times more than any other ethnic group. Lack of justice. Criminals easily get away by taking advantage of the legal complexities of reservation areas. Even though thousands of Native women have disappeared, the U.S. FBI or local police do not give these issues importance. This proves that the American administration's contempt for the lives of Native Americans has not ended. 6. Environmental protection and indigenous knowledge. Ironically, as the world grapples with climate change, white scientists are turning to the ancient knowledge of indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have been protecting nature for thousands of years, which Europeans have destroyed in the name of civilization. Indigenous peoples are currently fighting against the construction of pipelines because these pipelines are poisoning their sacred waters and lands. Their fight is not just for themselves, but for the protection of the environment of the whole world. Religious persecution, economic